Basically, I'm Saaz, and I interview elderly Sindhis and I collect their stories. And I'm going to talk to you now about some of the things that I've learned. So, I started off with my own mother. She was 13 years old when partition took place. And some of the things that she told me, I realized that they are very important and that I need to pass on this knowledge and the insights that I had from what she said. So I wrote a book, and then I continued this process because I realized that just interviewing just a few people, I mean, every time I interviewed another person, I learned something new. And to the extent that even now, it's been, I think, 8 or 9 years since I started. 2 days ago, I interviewed this elderly lady, Guli Chandnani. And she was born in 1928, which would make her 92 this year. And I actually connected with her because I was trying to find out more about Jacobabad. Now, perhaps you've heard about Jacobabad. It's a town in Sindh, and it's in the north of Sindh. It's a frontier town. And in those days, in the 1940s, Dadi Guli and her family lived there. Of course, she was a young girl at that time. She went to school in Jacobabad. Her father was an advocate, and her father's brother was the head of the municipality there. So I basically called her to ask her to get information about Jacobabad, which I wanted to know. So we talked, and she told me whatever she could, and then we were ending our conversation, and she came out with something which was so amazing. She just told me her own story, a small thing that happened. I mean, of course, when I say small thing, what I mean is it was a short thing. It was actually extremely important. So this was in November 1947, and it was immediately after partition, and the situation was quite dangerous because Hindus were being persecuted, and her father was trying to make sure that all his family members were safe. So she and he couldn't leave because he was being watched, and it was too dangerous for him to leave Jacobabad. So she and her mother were sent to Karachi, and this was for her wedding. She had been engaged a year ago, and they decided that now it'll be safest if she gets married. And unfortunately, he couldn't go, so he arranged for her and her mother to travel to Karachi by train. Now, how did these two women go alone? First of all, he had very influential friends, and they set up a guard of young men who traveled to protect them. And they traveled wearing burqas all the way from Jacobabad to Karachi, which is not a short journey. And when they reached, of course, they were the um, people who were guarding them were questioned, who are these people? And when they gave the name of the person who'd arranged it, they were allowed to go. And they were not seen at all because they were wearing burqas. So they went to the home of her bridegroom, and the marriage took place in the morning. And that afternoon at 4 o'clock, they got into the ship, that is Guli and her bridegroom and his brother. And the three of them took the ship and they went to Bombay, where they started a new life. Now, Guli, 92 years old, told me this story, and she said it all in such a matter of fact way, as if it was the most ordinary thing to happen. And I literally had my hair standing up in my arms thinking about this journey in which these two women, who they must have been so scared, they didn't know what was happening to them. She couldn't travel with her dad, and there was this whole situation with the trains full of dead bodies arriving in Sindh, and dead body, I mean, this so much of bloodshed that they were, and fear that they were surrounded by. And the second thing is how she had to leave her whole family and get married to somebody who she didn't know. And how old was she at that time? Because like I told you, she was born in 1928, which means she was just 19 years old, and she was, you can imagine a 19-year-old girl having this happen. But Dadi Goli was like so calm and comfortable about the whole thing, and I felt that this is The way that the Sindhis handled partition. They had terrible things happening to them, and they just took it. They, managed it. Of course, it must have been extremely difficult, but that's what they did. And I'm sure many of you have heard similar stories from your own families about how things happened. And what I feel is most of the stories I've heard, in fact, all the stories I've heard, people dealt with their difficult situations very bravely. And I really admire that a lot. I think that's amazing. Another thing which I learned, which I did not know before, was that though we say that it was a time when the two communities were fighting and there was a lot of bitterness, there was not just bitterness, there was slaughter, there was, a lot of things, a lot of bad things happened. But at the same time, every single story that I've heard, people have told me that we were saved by the other community. Even in this case, as you saw, Dadi Guli was brought to Karachi safely with her mother, with a team of people from the other community. And every story, including my family, everyone who I've heard. So, for me, I feel though politically this was a time when the two communities were pitted against each other, and secondly, a lot of people who were trying to exploit the situation, they did exploit the situation and took advantage. But by and large, human beings are kind to each other and they don't really look at, they realize that we are all, at the end of the day, we are all the same. What do we want in our lives? We want peace, we want a good future for our children. I mean, beyond that, that's the main thing. So this was one of the things I wanted to tell you, and I think that probably you're familiar with this kind of thinking. Again, what happened after partition? I'll tell you a story someone told me, and this is his name is Hari Govind Narayan Dubey, so he's not Sindhi himself. I interviewed him, and I helped him to write this book, which is the story of his father's life. And his father was a freedom fighter in Uttar Pradesh. So he worked in the villages. He worked to create awareness, and he worked to create awareness to stop the exploitation of poor people, and to create a feeling of towards self rule. And he was on the forefront in his area. And this gentleman, Mr. Hari Govind Narayan Dubey, he's also in his 90s now, and he was a young boy at the time of partition. His father was living in Agra at that time, and he was a student at BITS Pilani. And BITS Pilani was new, so I think he was in the second batch of BITS Pilani. He was studying to be an engineer, and he had come home to Agra to spend his holidays with his family. And he said that partition had taken place and Agra was full of refugees. So every day his father would go out in the morning arranging camps where the refugees were being fed, and arrangements were being made for their shelter. And he said one day he brought a Sindhi family home. And there was this man and his wife and their young son and the man's mother. So these four people came to their house, and they gave them the veranda to stay. So he said that they had nothing. They had not brought anything. They had only got there. In fact, when they had a bath, they had to wash their clothes and wear the same wet clothes again because they didn't have anything. So they gave them their food, and the next morning, the man went to the market and he bought a sack of grain. He went to the wholesale market, he bought a big sack of grain, and he sat down in the retail section and he started selling small quantities of grain cheaper than anyone else was selling. So very soon he sold the sack, and he sold all the grain, and then he sold the sack as well. That's another one of the stories that we always hear about the Sindhis after partition. They were so shrewd, they were so careful, they were so thoughtful that they would not even leave the sack. They would sell the sack, and that's how they could come up. This gentleman told me this, that this family, they came to us with nothing except the clothes they were wearing. On the third day, we did not have to feed them because he had earned something, and he said, now we don't want to take any charity. So this is another story again. I don't think it's anything new to any of you. You probably heard similar stories from your own families, from people who you know. And one thing I want to tell you is that if you haven't heard your family stories, you must try and sit down with your family elders or with your friends, parents, grandparents, and try and talk to them and let them tell you about their experiences or the stories that they've been told. Now, so far, I have only told you things that you already know. But now, what I want to do is go a little back into Sindh, and maybe some of the things which I have heard, they may also be familiar to you. But let me see. Let's try and see whether I am able to communicate something new to you about Sindh. Since this is a women's group, the first thing I want to tell you is that I've heard um, from some people that they knew women who were ticket checkers on the railway line in Sindh. They were railway ticket inspectors. For example, Maya Shahani, who you may be knowing, she's a very well-known person. She is from Katie Shahani family, and she is one of the founders of the engineering college of the family, and she's a trustee also of the Hyderabad Sindh National Collegiate Board. Her mother was a ticket checker on the line between Hyderabad and Karachi. Now, it's not a simple thing. When you say ticket checker, think about this. You have to check people's tickets. And what does that mean as a woman? It means that in Sindh, the men were okay with showing their ticket. You know, they were okay with taking the authority of a woman. And I think that's really amazing because I'm not sure whether it was that common in other parts of India, because we know that women have been suppressed and exploited in every country around the world. And in India, even today, most women don't really have a chance to have their own goals and their own dreams. And, you know, they are generally subjected to other people's ideas, you know, within the family. They have to do what is expected of them, and they don't really have a choice. And all of us come from different families, so we experience this to very, very different extents. But what I want you to know is that in Sindh, there were women who, even in the 40s, even when they were only 18, 19, 20 years old, they were to a certain extent independent. They had their own individuality, and to a lot of in a lot of families, women were respected. They weren't just treated as people who are supposed to do work and behave in a certain way. And I think one of the reasons for this is because women's education came to Sindh very early, and this would have been the first school for girls opened in Hyderabad in 1885. 1885. Just imagine how long ago that was. Um, it it wasn't. It couldn't have been easy, and even the most modern families would have hesitated sending their girls to school. And one of the big reasons, of course, is that it was an area close to the border where it was easy for women to get kidnapped and sold into slavery. Uh, you know, in the areas where women were used as slaves. So women had to be protected, but at the same time, progressive people realized that it's important to for women to also lead lives of their own, and you know, to have a certain understanding of the way the world works or whatever. One thing that I learned is that there were Sindhi families who were getting their daughters educated and becoming doctors, even sending them abroad to study. And the earliest one that I've heard of is Dr. Devi Lakhani. 1920, she was sent to England, and I think she must have come back with FRCS. I can't remember exactly, but 1920, which is, I mean, how long ago is that? Really long ago, 100 years ago. And in the 30s and 40s, there were many Sindhi women who were sent to study to be doctors in Lady Hardinge College in Delhi. So they used to go from Karachi, Hyderabad, Sakkar, Shikarpur, wherever, and they would stay in the hostel in Lady Hardinge College. So they were coming back to Sindh, and they were, women doctors, which made it a lot easier for the population, because one of the biggest medical issues in those days, which is of course even today a big issue, was the care for pregnant women and the safe delivery and looking after the new mother and the baby. And in those days, the risks of infection were much higher than they are today, because there was less knowledge and about aseptic environment, antiseptic environment. And also, the most of the men were doctors. So families weren't really that comfortable having their women attended by male doctors, and most of the childbirth was done by dais. So having women coming back as doctors into Sindh, that was such a big thing. It made a lot of difference to public health. And also, these women were role models to the other girls, because the girls knew that they can also be doctors if they want to. And after that, if you walk like in Bombay and Pune, there are so many those women. After partition, they had to settle elsewhere, and in Bombay there were so many Sindhi women doctors. Even now, if you look in Sion, and of course now most of them of those days are no more, but if you just in the 70s and 80s, you'd walk down the streets and you'd see these little signboards and so many women doctors. And maybe you're aware of them, maybe you also have some of them in your family. So I wanted to tell you about the doctors. And what else can I tell you about life in Sindh? One of the things I'm not sure if you would be knowing about is in the 40s. Sindh was a very big, there was a lot of participation in the freedom movement in Sindh. And, we don't think about this that often. Like, I came to know when I was working on this book, which is about the Amils. And I realized when I was writing this book, interviewing people, that so many people actually sacrificed themselves, and the families were so. I mean, I'm not trying to say that only the Amils were freedom fighters. There were freedom fighters from. In fact, one of the biggest hotspots, was actually Sakhar. You may have heard the name of Hemu Kalani. This was in 1942 when Gandhi announced the Quit India movement. And there was this huge wave all across India where people became so inflamed that yes, we must get independence and we want to have our own country. And the young people, they were writing pamphlets, they were distributing them, and all this was sedition. Anyone who was caught was in big trouble. And Hemu Kalani and a group of his friends, they got news that there's a train coming into Sakkar carrying ammunition to to quell the movement. So to stop that train, they diverted the tracks, and this happened. I've been told, I don't know the exact facts, but apparently there was a biscuit factory nearby, and the guards saw this activity and they alerted the police. And Hem Kalani was caught and he was taken to prison. And he was tried, and the sentence was that he should be hanged to death for what he's done. So, of course, people petitioned the viceroy, and after some thought, they were told that yes, we will pardon him, Kalani, if he gives us the names of the co conspirators. So Hem Kalani was informed that if you inform us who the others were, you will be set free. And he said, get lost. You can kill me if you want, but I'm not going to do that. And they hanged him. And how old was he? He was 19 years old. I'm sure some of you have heard of his name. Maybe you already know about him. There were so many others who gave up their lives. Like I found, and not only men, there were many women also. Like in this book, I came across somebody called Kamla Hiranan, who she was this young girl, and she was like slim and um, she didn't look like she was a young girl, and she would do things like go and lie on the floor in front of the collectors as a protest. So they would have to get her up, and she did things like, she was wearing a gold ring, and she just gave it away to. She gave it in as a donation to Gandhi's fund, and many of them did things like that. Then Rukmini Tarachand Lalwani, who, when her husband was arrested for being part of the freedom movement, she continued running their newspaper. And then there was Kala Shahani, who also did that. Her husband had a press, and he was taken into jail during the Quit India movement. But she refused to go and stay with her parents. She continued staying in the same house where she was, and she continued running the press secretly. And this was again like it was an act of very great bravery, and there were so many others like that. Another person who the Sindhis were doing it not just in Sindh. I have a case of Vishnu Shahani, who Shahani family actually came to Pune in the 1920s, and they opened a bookshop. So they were running the modern bookstall in a camp in Pune, and he was very much a part of the freedom movement. And he had written something which got caught, and actually it was a plea. It was a plea to the British. And at that time, the British were fighting the Second World War. So in his in his essay, he said that you are trying to defend yourselves against the Germans, and your freedom is so important to you, and you should understand how much freedom would mean to us. And for that, he was arrested and put into jail, and his father was arrested too. And they spent their he spent a long time in Yeroda jail in Pune. And because he and his father were not there, who was going to run the bookshop? So his sister Sati, who was also young, she was still a teenager, and she had no experience in doing something like this, but the family had to eat. And so she ran that shop. She had to, and who were their customers? I mean, a shop selling English books in a cantonment town. Most of the customers were the British soldiers. So when Gandhi's book Quit India came out, they actually had on their storefront Quit India, Quit India. They laid out all the books like that. So when the British soldiers came in to buy, they found it very annoying. And then, of course, ultimately, Vishnu and his dad, Jivatram, were both put in jail. After that, Sati, who was Vishnu's sister, elder sister, she ran the store. And both Vishnu and Sati, this freedom movement for them, Vishnu's education was interrupted, Sati never married. So, their lives, it interrupted their lives. It made their lives different from what it would have been if they hadn't been involved in that. And then what happened to them in 1947? They lost their own country. They could never go back to Sindh. So I think that we need to remember that Sindhis were freedom fighters also. And that's one of the things that I wanted to tell you about. So I will go back a little bit to the point of partition. Like I wanted to tell you a little about life in Sindh also, and the two topics that I chose for today were partly the women and the importance of education, and the freedom movement. So now I want to tell you about something that happened to me when I was interviewing my mother to tell me about her childhood. And she, was telling me about things like flying kites. Now, girls didn't really, they were not the ones who would fly kites. It was the boys who would fly the kites, and sometimes the girls would be given, a chance to hold and feel the kite and so on. And at some point, after, in fact, I think the book was ready by then, but my mom said, we could fly kites in Sindh all the year round. Like, I think I must have asked her, did you just fly at Sankranti? And she said, no, we could fly kites all the year round. And I said, how come? She said, we never had a monsoon in Sindh. Few days it would rain around Thadari. There would be rain and we would have our Thadari. We'd be at home. We would not cook and all that. And the schools would be closed. And she said, it was just 3 days or 4 days of rain right through the year in Hyderabad. And I'd never seen an umbrella. I mean, yeah, I'd seen an umbrella in the movies, but I had never seen a real umbrella. And that made me think about, we all of us know this, that when the Sindhis left Sindh, they settled in different places and they settled so well, so seamlessly. They started speaking the local languages and they integrated with the local population. They, nobody ever thinks that they came from somewhere else. But look at this small example of a family or a community, a group of families who came to Bombay from Karachi or Hyderabad, and it was raining and it was pouring and pouring, and they'd never seen anything like it. Just raining. Many of you know what Bombay rain is like. Once it just comes down and then it floods and then you can't go out and everything is damp and you know you get fungus on your shoes and the papad is like in 20 seconds your papad is soggy. And that was one of the things that, the huge changes. And then, of course, for the children, you're writing, you've learned how to write from right to left. And now you have to learn, it's completely gone. You have to write the other way. So many big changes. And it was all done so gracefully. I think that's something which has not been admired sufficiently. So, uh, is there any question or anything? I think I need to take a break from talking. I've got these two pictures behind me. Can you see them? So one of them, one of them has a family. In fact, both of them are family. They're probably the same family. In one, you can see a gentleman wearing white pajamas and a red cap. And both these paintings are done by a Shikarpuri painter by the name of Mengraj Talreja. He is also in his 90s. He was born in 1927 and he lives in Thane. And I went to his home to interview him. And he showed me his work. And when he showed me this painting, he said, "This is me and my mother and my father." And I was so moved by that that I requested him, asked him if I could buy it. And yeah, so I bought that, and then I bought the other one also, which I really liked. Which, if you can see it, I'm not sure how clearly you can see it, but that's a family who's sitting together, and that is Diwali. So they're celebrating Diwali. And one of the things that I find quite interesting about that picture is that look at the way they're dressed. You can't tell what religion they are. And I think that's the way it was in Sindh. There was a lot of syncretism. People were more uh, passionate about their being Sindhi. about their language, about their poetry, about their ways of thinking, and not that focused on the religion that they were. So I thought I'll read you a little piece from this book. This is the book which I was telling you about, which I wrote. It started with my mother's story, and then I interviewed a lot of other people as well. And one of the people whom I interviewed, her name is Rita Shahani. And Rita, actually, it's not because I just told you about Vishnu Shahani, because his story was the story of a freedom fighter. But it so happens that Rita was married to Vishnu. And Rita, she and her family, her father was a landlord, and they had actually come to Lucknow for some medical treatment that her father was having. And it was 1947. Nobody expected this to happen. They had come from Sindh, from Hyderabad, they'd come to Lucknow, and her father was undergoing the medical treatment, and then partition took place, and they could never go back. They never saw their home until later, many years later, when Rita went back. I'm going to read you something about that. But she got married to Vishnu, came and settled in Pune, and much later, when her children were grown up, she started writing. And she was a Sindhi writer, and she's very well known. She wrote, I don't know, I think I'm just going to tell you what she's, I'm going to tell you in her words. So this is Rita Shani. I started writing in 1982 when I was 46 years old, and in the 30 years since then, have had more than 40 books published. I've been lucky with supportive publishers and through them have met many other Sindhi writers in both India and Pakistan. I visited Sindh in July 2001 and had many interesting experiences. I stayed with the hospitable Mehtab Mehboob, a poet and writer in Hyderabad. We were followed everywhere by a jeep full of intelligence officers. Eventually, they borrowed a copy of one of my books from Mehtab and after reading it, concluded that I must be harmless. One day, we visited the site of my old home where I had lived as a child. My friend, the writer Waliram Vallabh, wrote about our visit in the newspaper Kavish. My family's mansion had been pulled down, and in its place was a multi-storied building. One wall of our old home still stood. It was attached to the adjacent building. We visited a family who lived in it, a brother and sister who were both professors. They showed us a cupboard in their home with the inscription, Vindri Tejumal Jo Hi Kabad Trigo Kolendo, Unake Paap Lagando. Nobody knew who Vindri Tejumal was, but the image of a woman carving this message into her cupboard as she and her family left their home, confident that they would come back one day, was an evocative one. Our hosts told us that their house was indeed haunted and they could hear a benign spirit on the other side of the wall in the place where our family temple had been. A few days after Waliram Saad's article appeared, we were attending a book launch at the Sindhi Language Authority when the poet Zubair Sumro came on stage to read out a poem he had written in response to it. And this is Zubair's poem. It's called Borders by Zubair Sumro. Enduring the pain that borders can impose, she continued to weep. And wandering the myriad bylanes of the past, she continued to weep. And in her altered city, now peopled with strangers, she continued to weep. This woman from Pune, in clothes tailored from Sindhi fabric, is searching for her home in Sindh, searching for closure of the past. But the city inside her was orphaned 50 years ago. And in her ancestral city, where has her courtyard gone? In the foundation of that courtyard, a child of 13 is playing a game, but her childhood is buried, and her laughter is buried. The echoing peals of that laughter continue to ring out. Today, that Sindhi woman who had never dared to laugh so loudly finds those peals of suppressed laughter are somehow still resident in Sindh. She weeps. She is inconsolable. She never wanted to return. And today, the 13-year-old darling longs to play once again in her childhood courtyard. Who can console her? Who will explain to her the pain that borders can impose? She must stop being so stubborn. We are equally helpless. This 50-year-old trauma which clouds up our eyes, which can destroy in a moment the castles of our dreams. This Sindhi woman from India will go back home again, carrying the gift of this trauma from Sindh. And then Rita says, I'm not a person who shows my emotions in public, but I must admit that as he read the line, she continued to weep. Tears rolled helplessly down my cheeks. So that's all from me now. I'm going to stop. If you have anything you want to ask, let me know.